November 12th, 1970. A quiet night along the coast of the Bay of Bengal. By morning, villages no longer existed. The sea had taken roads, homes, and nearly 500,000 lives. No storm before or after has matched its death toll. This was the Great Bhola Cyclone. One of the deadliest hurricanes humanity ever faced. What a lot of people don't know is that the start of this hurricane was anything but deadly. It didn't begin as a monster. It didn't arrive with violence. In fact, at first, it looked like just another ordinary storm forming over the Bay of Bengal, something this region has seen many times before. And yet, the reason this hurricane would become so deadly was not because it was the strongest storm ever recorded. The reason was far simpler and far more terrifying. But before we get there, we need to understand how this storm even began its way towards becoming the deadliest hurricane known to humanity. To do that, we have to go back a few days earlier, back to a time when life still existed normally, in the place that would soon be erased. Along the low-lying coast of East Pakistan, what is now Bangladesh, daily life moved on as usual. The land here was flat, made of rivers, islands, and muddy ground barely above sea level. Entire communities lived only a few feet above the ocean, surrounded by water on all sides. Homes were simple, built from bamboo, mud, and tin. They were never designed to face a wall of seawater, but no one expected one to come. Fishermen went out to sea like they always had. Markets stayed open. Children played near the shoreline as the sun dropped into the horizon. Bright sunsets reflected off the water, calm and peaceful, giving no sign of what was approaching. Out in the Bay of Bengal, a small tropical disturbance had begun to form. At first, it barely stood out. Storms formed in this region every year, especially during this season. Weather monitoring was limited, and what little information existed moved slowly. As the days passed, the storm slowly strengthened. Air pressure dropped, winds increased. But on land, almost nothing changed. There were no mass warnings, no organized evacuations, no shelters prepared to receive people. Even worse, many of the warnings that did exist never reached the people who needed them most. Some messages were delayed, others were misunderstood. In many villages, nothing was heard at all. By November 11th, the storm had grown into a powerful cyclone. Still, most families along the coast went to sleep that night, believing the next day would come like any other. They didn't know the storm would arrive under the cover of darkness. They didn't know the ocean would rise faster than anyone could run. And they didn't know that one simple failure, not nature alone, was about to turn this storm into the deadliest hurricane humanity has ever faced.
Time and again, they've ravaged India, Bangladesh, and their neighbors. One such cyclone in 1970.
As November 12th began, the storm was no longer just forming, it was moving fast. And it was aimed directly at the most vulnerable coastline on Earth. Satellite estimates at the time suggested winds of over 115 miles per hour, and the cyclone was advancing at roughly 20 miles per hour, giving people almost no time to react. By the early evening, the wind had already begun to change. It no longer came in short bursts. It pushed steadily, bending trees and rattling the thin walls of coastal homes. Rain followed soon after, heavy and constant, soaking the land before the storm had even arrived. Out at sea, fishermen were already in trouble. Many never made it back. Their boats were small. The waves were growing taller by the hour, with no warning system reaching them. They had no chance to escape. As night fell, the cyclone continued to strengthen. Winds increased sharply, tearing roofs from homes and sending debris through villages. But the wind was not the real threat. The ocean was. Around midnight, the storm surge began. Water started rising along the coast, slow at first, then faster than anyone expected. What made it deadly was how flat the land was. There were no hills to climb, no high ground to reach. The water didn't rush in like a wave, it crept, and then it swallowed everything. By the early hours of the morning, entire islands were already underwater. Villages vanished in darkness. Homes were lifted from the ground and carried away, as if they weighed nothing. Families were torn apart as people tried to hold on to trees, rooftops, anything that could keep them above the water. The surge reached heights of up to 30 feet in some areas. That is higher than most buildings in the region. Once the water reached that level, survival became nearly impossible. People drowned in their homes. Others were swept into open water. Many never knew what hit them. By 2 a.m., the cyclone had fully made landfall. Winds screamed across the delta, but the water had already done its work. Entire communities were gone, and still, the storm kept pushing inland. By dawn, the cyclone began to weaken, but the damage was complete. Where villages had stood the night before, there was only water, debris, and silence. Bodies were trapped in trees, tangled in fishnets, or buried under mud. There were no lights, no roads, no way to call for help. The storm moved on, but the ocean stayed. And when the sun finally rose over the Bay of Bengal, it revealed something no one was prepared to see. An entire region had been erased in a single night. Nearly 500,000 people were dead, not because the storm was the strongest ever recorded, but because the water arrived when no one was warned, no one was prepared, and no one could escape. And only later would the world begin to understand how a disaster of this scale was allowed to happen at all. When the storm finally passed, the silence was not relief. It was shock. Survivors climbed onto broken rooftops and trees, looking out over a world that no longer made sense. Where villages once stood, there was only water and debris. Roads were gone, landmarks were gone. Entire islands had disappeared from the map. And that's when the true reason this disaster became the deadliest hurricane in human history began to surface. Because the cyclone itself was powerful, but it was not unmatched. The winds reached speeds similar to other major storms in the Bay of Bengal. The pressure was extreme, but not unheard of. On paper, this storm should have been survivable. So why did nearly 500,000 people die? The answer was painfully simple. Warnings existed, but they failed. Weather officials had detected the cyclone. Alerts were issued, but many of them were sent in technical language that rural communities didn't understand. Others were broadcast too late. Some never reached the coastline at all. In many villages, people didn't know a cyclone was coming until the water was already at the doors. Even worse, there were almost no cyclone shelters. The region had millions of people living just feet above sea level, yet there were very few safe places to run. No elevated buildings, no reinforced structures, no evacuation plans that could move entire communities in time. And then there was the timing. The storm surge hit at night. People were asleep. Visibility was zero. By the time families realized the ocean was rising, escape was already impossible. Parents tried to lift children onto roofs that were ripped away seconds later. Entire households were lost without ever being counted. To understand how deadly this hurricane truly was, you need perspective. In the history of that entire region, no single disaster had ever come close to this scale. The Great Bhola Cyclone killed more people in one night than all the other hurricanes combined in that area for decades. No storm before it, and none since, has ever matched its death toll. This was not just the deadliest hurricane in the Bay of Bengal. It was the deadliest tropical cyclone humanity has ever recorded. And the tragedy didn't end when the water stopped. In the days that followed, survivors faced hunger, disease, and complete isolation. Crops were destroyed. Drinking water was contaminated. Bodies laid unburied in the heat. Help was slow to arrive, and when it did, it was nowhere near enough. The Great Bhola Cyclone didn't become deadly because it was unstoppable. It became deadly because it was ignored, and that realization would go on to change disaster response forever. Not just in Bangladesh, but around the world. But this raises another equally important question. What was the reaction to this hurricane? And more importantly, what does that place look like today? When news of the Great Bhola Cyclone finally reached the broader world, the scale of the disaster was almost unimaginable. Entire coastal regions were submerged. Millions were homeless. Hundreds of thousands were dead. The first reports were conflicting and incomplete for weeks. No one knew the full extent of the devastation. The government of Pakistan, which at the time ruled over East Pakistan, was slow to respond. Relief efforts were poorly coordinated. Supplies of food, water, and medicine barely reached the affected areas. Roads and bridges had been destroyed by the storm, cutting off access to many of the worst-hit communities. Airlifts were limited, and many villages were impossible to reach for days, leaving survivors to fend for themselves. International aid began to arrive, but even that faced enormous challenges. Helicopters struggled to land on the flooded delta. Ships had to navigate rivers blocked by debris. Volunteers and relief organizations worked tirelessly, but the scale of destruction meant that even the fastest response was never enough. People were dying, not just from the storm itself, but from hunger, disease, and exposure in the aftermath. For many, the first hope of rescue came only days after the floodwaters receded. The cyclone also triggered political consequences. The slow and inadequate response fueled resentment in East Pakistan, contributing to tension that would later lead to the independence of Bangladesh in 1971. The world began to realize that natural disasters could not be measured solely by wind speed or rainfall. Human systems, governance, and preparation were just as critical. But what does that place look like today? 17 years later, and even decades after, the Bay of Bengal Delta is still shaped by that night. Many towns were rebuilt in the exact same locations, but modern shelters and cyclone warning systems now protect millions. Early warning systems now allow residents to evacuate before a storm strikes. Schools and public buildings are often reinforced to act as emergency shelters. Yet, despite progress, the scars of that storm remain. Generations were lost, farmland was altered, and entire communities were permanently displaced. In short, the land has recovered physically in many ways, but the memory of that night, the horror of the storm surge, and sheer scale of human loss are deep into the identity of this region. Every cyclone season brings fear. Every rising tide recalls the night that the ocean came and changed everything forever. The Great Bhola Cyclone did more than destroy towns. It reshaped an entire country, influenced global disaster response, and left a legacy that still teaches the world how deadly nature can be, especially when human mistakes make it even worse. Subscribe for more hurricane content like this.